My name is Professor Tonya Kowalski, and I'll be talking today about the likely effects of the pandemic on Indian country. Indian country is a federal term of art and also a term widely used to refer to Native American communities within the United States, and sometimes to the subset of those communities called the federally recognized tribes. It's really important for us to address this topic in the colloquium because Native American communities are so often ignored or marginalized. And of course, that can have especially devastating effects during a time of crisis. And so it's very important to understand how the pandemic will affect these communities. I thought it would be a good idea to start with just a very quick primer. We can't do it justice in the time that we have available, but for those who are less familiar with this topic, there are hundreds and hundreds of sovereign Indian nations within the United States. As of February 2020, there were 574 federally recognized tribes and dozens more tribes who are seeking recognition or who have state recognition. It's very important to understand that these are political entities within the United States. When tribes are recognized by the federal government, for example, they are engaged in what's called a government-to-government relationship with the United States, almost like a diplomatic relationship, but something more. The Supreme Court has described these nations as domestic dependent nations somewhat unfavorably, but embedded within that concept is that Native American nations have reserved sovereignty. And so they still have many, many aspects of their political sovereignty that they enjoyed before that would have been recognized by European powers, for example, and that they had inherently before the time of colonization. And so that still exists to this day, to the extent that they have not been usurped by Congress, for example. Although the effects on health are most paramount in our minds at this moment, it's important also to think about what the effects on tribal economies will be. These are developing nations within the United States. Most tribes are still recovering from the effects of colonization and will be for a long time. And so they are working hard to develop their own economies so that they can raise the standard of living for their residents, which unfortunately, even though the United States has a treaty obligation to ensure that basic standard of living, it has not historically met that obligation. And so tribes are working hard for themselves to develop their economies, but many, maybe even most, are in really remote locations where they have to really create their own opportunities, which is one of the reasons why gaming has become so prevalent. And so many are reliant still on gaming as their primary employer other than tribal government, and also for the income that they desperately need for basic services for their communities. And so the effects of the closures of gaming operations on Indian country are going to be devastating because it is so central to so many of those economies. And now to the effect on health services, most prominent on our minds right now. The United States, as one of its many treaty obligations to many tribes, owes Native American communities a right to health care and has created a federal agency for that called the Indian Health Service. It is chronically underfunded and understaffed, unfortunately, even going into this pandemic. And so it is disturbing to hear that the Indian Health Service is already starting at a deficit and is, of course, suffering even worse problems with the lack of supplies that it needs to deal with the pandemic, including personal protective equipment and more rapid testing. As of about a week ago, the reports were that although clinics did have some tests available, they were of the simpler swab variety that has to be sent to central labs. And with those kinds of tests, of course, it takes longer to get the results, making it more likely that there will be delays in isolating people, which will lead to much greater rates of infection and, unfortunately, probably also fatalities. To top it off, Native American communities already do not enjoy the best community health. There are high rates of diabetes and hypertension. And many Native Americans communities, because they suffer from the effects of rural poverty, also have lack access to some of the important prerequisites for health, including safe drinking water, sanitation practices, and so on. And finally, a topic that may not be as obvious at first, but that is also likely to be devastating for some communities, is the effect of this pandemic on culture. And that's because so many cultural practices and native language speaking abilities rest with elders in the community. And of course, we know that elders are among the very most vulnerable. It's important to understand that one of the reasons why transmission of culture may have been broken or muted in many communities, and by that I mean the ability to transmit that culture from elders to the younger generation. Why that's been broken or interrupted in so many communities is that, or reduced, is because the United States engaged for centuries in a concerted official practice of assimilation. And it was this was up to approximately the 1970s, mid to late 1970s. And beginning in the 1800s, where the United States made a concerted effort to try to divorce Native American people from their native languages, their religious practices, and their other cultural practices in order to forcibly assimilate them into American culture. And one of the most pernicious practices among these was taking generations of children away from their families, forcibly removing them and putting them into boarding schools where they were forbidden from speaking their languages, practicing their religions, and engaging in other types of cultural practices, including traditional knowledge, ceremonies, and so on. And so for that reason, even though there has been a great effort in tribes today to revitalize those practices and to make sure that they are safeguarded for the future, the rapid loss of elders would be a huge loss to that effort. And so unfortunately, I fear that it is probably creating a race against time at this point. And so finally, moving to our last topic, there is a right to health guaranteed in the law of international human rights. And this pertains also specifically to indigenous communities. And so the United States is a signatory or a member to several major international human rights treaties or declarations that guarantee health to its indigenous peoples. And that includes some of the ones that you see here, and specifically the aspirational version of that comes in a unique document created just for Indigenous peoples, which is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And it's important to know that in all of these documents, that it's not just the right to medical services, basic medical services that's guaranteed. It's actually also the right to the prerequisites for good community health. And so we were speaking a moment ago about how some communities, because of rural poverty, suffer from lack of safe drinking water and sanitary practices and so on. Well, that is actually, those fundamental prerequisites are actually guaranteed by international human rights law. So this is one of the areas in which the United States still falls short on its treaty obligations, and that unfortunately is likely to worsen the effects of the pandemic. Well, that's all for this presentation, but before we go, I would like to just take a moment to pause and recognize the past and present stewards of these lands that we enjoy in Kansas. Thank you very much for your participation.